Charlotte Hayes, a 20-year-old woman, claims to have received a message from heaven after suffering a bicycle accident. A disturbing message addressed directly to Donald Trump. According to her testimony, she saw an intense light. She heard a voice and perceived a date with a disturbing éclaircie, June 21st, 2025. The most surprising thing is that this same date was mentioned weeks earlier by Bella Martinez, a 16-year-old girl after her own near-death experience. Two young women, two different experiences, one warning. Why them? Because that date in particular. And what is expected of Trump? This is not just a tale from SM. This is a prophetic vision that seems to point to the same destiny, the direction of the planet. Subscribe, comment, and share. What you are about to discover goes beyond anything you thought possible. The message is authentic, and the clock is ticking. My name is Charlotte Hayes. I'm 20 years old, and I lived in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Since I was a child, I've always been passionate about ancient archaeology. I studied anthropology, fascinated by lost civilizations and forgotten rituals. I spent my days deciphering symbols in Mayan manuscripts and my nights reading esoteric texts. Those around me considered me somewhat strange. Even my parents, although open-minded, often told me that I spent too much time in museums and not enough living in the present. I wasn't a complete believer, but I wasn't an atheist either. I was certain there was something beyond, although I refused to give it a name. A month before the accident, I participated in an excavation on a desert plateau, isolated from everything. We discovered a very peculiar circular site with stones arranged like the marks of an inverted clock. Some were engraved with eyeless faces and deformed crosses, as if they had melted into the rock. An inverted spiral figure also appeared, repeated several times. Since that expedition, I began to experience unexplained dizziness. Insects appeared in my room, even though the windows were closed. One night, I dreamed of a bald man wearing a coat made of chains. He didn't speak. He only showed me a mural showing a man with his arms raised, vanishing into the light. The week before the accident, my phone was locked at exactly 4:44 for 3 days straight. My emails would empty themselves, and my notes would be replaced by unknown Sumerian-like characters. I thought it was a technical glitch. I didn't tell anyone. The day of the accident, I was riding my bike back from the library. I remember passing through an alley I never took. On the ground, drawn in chalk, was the same inverted spiral. I stopped without knowing why and suddenly felt a shock in my chest. I lost control of the handlebars, even though there was no visible obstacle. The bike slid as if the ground had turned to liquid. My body was thrown forward and collided with a metal structure. The impact was violent, but just as my head hit the pavement, everything stopped. I saw my last breath leave my mouth like a dark mist. I never imagined that my life would cross the threshold of the invisible, and that what I was about to experience would be unlike any near-death experience I had heard before. I didn't have time to process what was happening. A scream, the squeal of brakes, and then nothingness. It was as if the world had collapsed beneath my wheels. I felt the bike slide, my head hit something solid, and then a silence so profound it seemed to swallow all reality. There was no sound. Just an absolute emptiness. And then I opened my eyes. But they weren't my eyes. I was suspended in the air, floating above my own body. A small group of people had gathered below. Some curious onlookers were leaning over me. A man was talking on the phone. A woman was crying, but I couldn't hear anything. Everything was happening in an icy, almost sacred silence. Time had frozen. Even the leaves on the trees had stopped moving. Suddenly, without warning, a crack appeared in the asphalt just below me. It wasn't a physical crack, but I could see it clearly. It began to open slowly, as if an invisible force were separating it, and I was gently sucked inside. I didn't feel fear. It was rather a strange calm, as if something inside me knew this journey was inevitable. I found myself inside a tunnel, but not like the ones usually described in SM. This one was upside down, as if I were falling upward. The walls were formed by a bluish, pulsing, almost liquid light. There were sounds, but they weren't human sounds. They were chantments, vibrations, whispers from another plane. I didn't understand the words, but I felt what they meant. They spoke of urgency, of transition, of awakening. At the end of the tunnel, everything stopped. There was no more light or sound, just a suspended space floating in a kind of infinite void. I was in what seemed like a cosmic amphitheater. There was no floor, no ceiling, just a circular platform in the center where I stood, and all around me, eyes, thousands of eyes suspended in the air, all fixed on me. There were no faces, no emotions, just the silent observation of what I was. I felt no fear, no judgment, just observed. And then he appeared. There was no blinding light, no trumpets, just a presence. At first, blurred, then more defined. A white figure approached. He wore a long robe, and his face, I can't describe it with human words, was the face of Jesus I knew. But it was also something more infinite, present in every thought, every glance. He had no mouth, yet he spoke to me, not with words, but with his thoughts. Charlotte, time is no longer a luxury. The man they call Trump must heed the call. His eyes were calm but charged with immense gravity. It wasn't a reproach, it wasn't a threat, it was simply a truth. Behind him, doors of light opened like curtains suddenly drawn back. And then I saw, they weren't dreams, they were revelations, truths. A colossal hurricane ravaging New York, erasing its streets as if they had never existed. Flames devouring the oceans, a dry, cracked land, incapable of sustaining life. A gigantic hand formed of shadow and fire descending upon the White House with a silent roar, and then Donald Trump walked alone across a glass bridge suspended in the void. The glass shattered beneath their steps. Above it, a clock spun backward. The number 21 flashed over and over. I turned to Jesus, or rather, my conscience turned to him and spoke to me. This isn't a punishment. It's an opportunity, but you must act before June 21st. I wanted to understand. I cried out within myself, "Why me? Why are you showing this to me?" His response was gentle, but firm as a sword, because you are between two worlds, and some will hear your cry. At that precise moment, everything began to shake. The eyes around me closed one after the other. The ground or whatever it was beneath my feet crumbled. An invisible force grabbed me and tore me from that place. I was propelled at an indescribable speed through space. I felt my mind compress, my consciousness shrink, as if I were returning to a human body. Then, a loud, brutal sound, an alarm, voices, and I opened my eyes. I was in a hospital bed. A doctor was leaning over me. My mother was crying. A nurse was shouting that my heart had started beating again. I screamed, not out of pain, but because I still carried what I had seen inside me, because I still had that image of the glass bridge and the cursed clock in my mind. My mother leaned over me, trembling, placed her hand on my forehead, and said, "You're alive." and I answered in a whisper, "With all the fear in the world stuck in my throat, we must warn him. He's going to lose more than his power. The weeks that followed my return are a blur. I was here, but different. My body responded, but my mind seemed suspended between two realities. I struggled to speak. I struggled to put into words what I had witnessed, so I chose to remain silent. I remained silent. A long silence. The nights were the worst. I would wake up startled, drenched in sweat, tormented by the vision of the bridge. I could still hear those strange chants, Jesus' voice echoing in the depths of my being, like a wave impossible to turn off. I was afraid to sleep, but I was also terrified of staying awake. One day, without thinking, I began to draw. It was like a sudden need. My hands moved on their own, first with strokes, then faces, symbols. I drew the eyes of Jesus, although I had never learned how. Then, clocks that turned upside down, and in the center of a sheet of paper, a name written in bright red, Trump, surrounded by a circle of flames. When my mother saw the drawings, she burst into tears. My father thought I was suffering from a post-traumatic stress disorder. My friends began to drift away. Some whispered that I had lost my mind, but others looked at me with respect, almost fear. They said I had returned with something, that I had touched something sacred. I distanced myself from my studies, biology, cells, matter. Suddenly, all of that seemed so limited, so blind. One day I told my teacher, "I no longer want to heal bodies. I want to awaken souls." He looked at me as if he didn't recognize me. Maybe I wasn't the same anymore. I immersed myself in the search, not a scientific one, but a spiritual one. I began reading everything I could find about near-death experiences, testimonies, visions, messages received, and then I gave ancient contexts, books covered in dust forgotten by time. In one of them, I found a symbol identical to the one I had drawn, an inverted clock surrounded by fire. Next to it, a phrase in Latin, "Speculum fractum lumen, frangit." The broken mirror breaks the light. One night I fell asleep after hours of reading, and there, in a strange, lucid dream, the voice returned. It was the same voice from that high place. It told me, "You are the messenger. It's not a warning of death, but of transformation." The words echoed strongly, but not with fear. Then, another message was revealed to me, clear as if written in the stars. If man forgets his soul, he will lose the world. And finally, Trump is a mirror, not a cause. But mirrors can also break the light. When I woke up, I no longer doubted. I was not chosen. I was not a saint. But I had returned with a message, and that message did not belong to me. Then I decided to speak. I'm not saying I'm a prophet. I don't have answers. I'm not announcing the end of the world, but I know what I saw. I know what I was told. And to remain silent would be to betray that truth. So I speak, I write, I bear witness, not because I am important, but because the message is. I am not a prophet. I am the megaphone of an invisible call, and that call still resonates. Most near-death experiences follow a relatively familiar pattern: a tunnel of light, a sense of immense peace, a reunion with loved ones or spiritual figures, and sometimes a judgment or a life review. These accounts share universal elements: love, forgiveness, light. But Charlotte Hayes' testimony radically breaks with that structure. In her experience, there is no immediate peace. Instead, there is a palpable, divine tension, a sense of urgency, almost a spiritual alarm. Where others speak of a warm welcome, she describes the weight of a cosmic silence, the impression of a countdown suspended in the air. Another fundamental difference is the figure of Christ as she saw him. While Jesus appears in some of Her Majesty's accounts as a loving and reassuring presence, in Charlotte's case, he is grave, immense, charged with absolute heavenly authority. He doesn't come to console, he comes to warn. He doesn't extend his hand. He delivers a message and, above all, an almost unprecedented event: the explicit mention of a living world leader. Very few testimonies allude to political figures, and even fewer directly name someone, in this case Donald Trump, and link him to a specific date, June 21st. What makes this MH even more unique are the powerful and never-before-documented symbols that accompany it. A cracked glass bridge, inverted clocks, a cosmic amphitheater filled with floating eyes. These elements have never been recorded in traditional databases of near-death experience researchers. Several specialists are already beginning to describe his MH as categorical. Not simply a personal revelation, but a collective message with a spiritual and geopolitical dimension, a kind of universal call. In a thirsty world, in a sense, Charlotte's story provokes unsettling questions, and for some, sounds like a modern prophecy. Charlotte Hayes's testimony is one of the most disturbing and disconcerting ever reported. It goes beyond what we understand as a near-death experience. It is not just a spiritual vision. It is a call, a warning, a cry from a place where time no longer exists. What happened on January 15, 2025 in Denver was not just any accident. It was the beginning of a message, a signal directed not to a single soul, but to an entire world in imbalance. And now a date resonates. June 21st, 2025. A marker in the future, a celestial alarm, or an illusion, no one can say for sure. But one thing is certain. Something was seen. Something was said. And you, what would you do if heaven designated you as messenger of a truth that no one wants to hear? If a voice asked you to warn a man capable of affecting the destiny of millions of human beings? Subscribe, comment, share this testimony. Together, let's make heard what others refuse to hear. Because remember, the silence of heaven is not forgetfulness, it's a countdown.